On Friday, the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. hosted this discussion on the future of the European Union. Speakers included U.S. Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer and the former president of the European Parliament. Helping to organize the event, the University of Paris and the International Institute of Public Administration. It's 3 hours and 10 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, maybe it's time for us to begin this afternoon. We have, as you can see from the program, a very distinguished leading speaker and then a very distinguished panel to follow. The topic is a very broad one, deliberately so. It's to try to take a large look at all the questions about the enlargement of the European Union and what this means for the character of the European Union, both in psychological terms and also in structural terms. And we have a great variety of people who can bring different perspectives to this question, and we want to promote a very free-willing discussion. Our leading speaker, as you can see, is Simone Veil. I won't go on at great length with these introductions because in effect they were made this morning earlier. But Simone Veil, as I think most of you know, is one of France's most distinguished and certainly most esteemed public figures. She was born in Nice, trained as a lawyer. She's held numerous public offices, been in the cabinet twice, concerned with health questions, Social Security, and so on. She was has been a member of the European Parliament from 1979 to 1993, and president of the Parliament from 79 to 82. She's now has been a member of the French Constitutional Council since 1998. She has numerous decorations and awards from many countries. Madame Veil, we're very pleased that you're here. Please come and enlighten us.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, Mesdames, Messieurs. L'identité européenne, rêve, fantasme ou réalité? La réponse me paraît évidente. Encore faut-il que cette réalité soit explicitée et mise en perspective. Tout autant que les identités nationales, l'identité européenne s'inscrit dans la sphère de l'irrationnel et de l'affectif, même si forgée à travers des liens tissés au cours de l'histoire commune, elle repose sur des données concrètes. Elle est la traduction plus ou moins affirmée d'une appartenance à un ensemble européen dont on peut observer qu'il est aux dimensions variables. En l'espèce, c'est de l'identité européenne, de l'Union européenne qu'il s'agit, telle que constituée des 15 États membres, mais qui déjà se projette dans un avenir où l'Union pourrait comprendre 18, 25 ou même davantage d'États membres. S'il a fallu 2 guerres mondiales et des dizaines de millions de morts pour que les 6 pays fondateurs s'unissent au sein d'un cadre institutionnel, l'histoire de l'Europe n'est pas seulement celle de ces guerres fratricides. Pendant des siècles, voire plus d'un millénaire, les forces se sont conjuguées pour doter l'ensemble du continent européen d'une véritable identité. La chrétienté, les universités, la culture, le commerce et même la diplomatie, notamment à travers des liens de parenté entre les familles régnantes. La diversité des populations au sein d'une Europe morcelée à l'extrême ne doit pas occulter l'édification d'un socle de traditions et de références qui leur sont communes, y compris d'ailleurs les malheurs partagés que l'on vit encore ensemble. Il est intéressant de souligner qu'au lendemain de la guerre de 1945, très rapidement, les veuves de guerre des deux pays, la France et l'Allemagne, auxquelles je crois se sont associées également des veuves d'autres pays, ont constitué des associations et se sont longtemps fréquentées, comme on dit, mises en commun leurs soucis, leurs difficultés, mais aussi leurs joies quand elles ont pu en avoir. J'ai été rarement aussi émue il y a quelques années qu'en regardant l'émission de 7 sur 7, émission très connue en France, qu'Helmut Kohl avait enregistrée. C'était une émission de dimanche soir, alors très regardée, tenue par une journaliste connue, Anne Sinclair. Helmut Kohl parlait de l'Europe. C'était une de ses dernières interventions et je crois qu'il parlait du traité de Maastricht. Que disait-il à propos de l'Europe? Il disait surtout, il racontait comment dans sa famille l'Europe avait pris d'importance, comment c'était devenu un véritable engagement, et je pense que la façon dont il parlait, c'était aussi la façon de dire qu'il accepterait, lui, encore, de mourir pour l'Europe, puisque ce matin on nous parlait, est-on capable de mourir pour l'Europe? Mais il était question de mort, et il était question de mort en disant que justement on ne mourrait plus pour l'Europe. On ne mourrait plus pour l'Europe, et il expliquait qu'il avait eu un oncle qui s'appelait Walter, qui lui était mort à la guerre de 14. Et puis, il y avait eu ensuite, lui-même, Kohl, un frère qui s'était appelé Walter, en souvenir de cet oncle qui s'était appelé Walter. Et puis pendant la guerre de 40-45, 39-45, ce frère, Walter, avait été tué aussi à la guerre. Et il a dit ensuite, quand j'ai eu un fils, je l'ai tout de même appelé Walter parce que j'ai espéré qu'il ne mourrait pas à la guerre. J'ai dans ma famille une histoire semblable, tout à fait similaire. Le prénom était André. Il y a eu un oncle, il y a eu pour un grand-oncle, un oncle, mais quand j'ai eu un fils, je n'ai pas eu le courage. Ils avaient été tués, mais quand j'ai eu un fils, moi je n'ai pas eu le courage de l'appeler André. J'avais peut-être moins confiance qu'Helmut Kohl dans l'Europe. Je crois que maintenant nous pourrons utiliser tous les prénoms sans avoir à commémorer de ceux qui sont disparus, mais sans avoir peur d'en donner d'autres. Au lendemain de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, la division de l'Europe, consacrée par les accords de Yalta, a bouleversé la situation des pays d'Europe centrale et de l'Est. Ils ont été désormais soumis à la domination de l'Union soviétique, tandis que leurs voisins immédiats étaient contraints à une neutralité vigilante. Pour les pays de l'Europe de l'Ouest, la nécessité de faire front contre cette menace soviétique les a conduits à renforcer leurs liens avec les États-Unis au sein de l'Alliance Atlantique. Si le désir de paix et de réconciliation fut en 1950 le puissant ferment wish to resist the Soviet threat was one of the thoughts that the founding fathers of the European community had in mind. A new European identity thus appeared among the 6 countries that signed the Treaty of Rome. The implementation of the common market through a dense network of legal network which enabled people, goods and services and monies to circulate, the implementation of common policies, amongst others the agricultural policies, solidarity members taken among member countries through transfers for the more poor countries and regions, the support of the political, all of this supported the political will of those founding fathers who were trying to create a true European political entity with a federal basis. If for various reasons the hope that the European Union had thus generated the hope that the European Union would become a true federal political entity, the institutional provisions implemented by the Treaty of Rome and the implementation of the various goals of the European Union enabled to
create an area which really was an entity for the future, for the new generations. The European Union had become such a reality that any step backwards, amongst others, the possibility of a new conflict, seems now impossible. And one can now say that Europe was a victim of its own success. This is maybe one of the reasons why the humanitarian disasters and the wars that came after Yugoslavia broke up concerned more the inhabitants of our countries, amongst others the young peoples, who thought that wars were impossible in Europe, and then they made the institutional Europe responsible for this, because this Europe had not reacted in due time. But one should have considered that without Europe, and without trying to find a common position, the conflict would have degenerated considerably, and that it is because there was not enough Europe, and amongst other things, in matters pertaining to defense, that the Europeans were not in a position to intervene without the support of the United States. I do not have enough time, so I can't develop this train of thought enough. When the ex-Yugoslavia started breaking down, the British and the French, on the one hand, tended to support Serbia. This was as a result of old tradition that went at least back to World War I. And the Germans were naturally more in favor of Croatia. And the tensions were strong before, on one side and on the other, one could reach an agreement. And so we were closer to having a Second World War II for Sarajevo once again. Since an agreement could not be reached on institutional progress, especially when these regards member states, during the previous decades, the European community had foreseen successive enlargements based on strengthening of the institutions. The European general elections did not go together with a transfer of power enough to bring citizens closer to the institutions, so that the citizens thus feel that there was a true democracy in this Europe, a democracy that was lacking. For the populations, the European notion did not have the same sense. For the British, what was the most important was to not stay outside of the community. But most of them were always hostile to integration. Great Britain is still an island, despite the channel. For others, peace did not mean that much for Spain and Portugal, but they wanted more economic prosperity, the opening of their markets, and free access for their workers to the other countries. But what was important for them was the fact that they were admitted as other democracies in this exclusive club. So this was an approval for Spain and Portugal after their years of totalitarian regimes. So there was a lack of progress, and the European identity was weakened, and the European community was not quite comfortable with itself. This period could be symbolized through the phrase of Margaret Thatcher's phrase when she said, "I want my money back." Neither the European monetary system, and as I have said, the implementation, or the European Parliament, as I said before, or the progress of political cooperation put an end to this malaise of all those who found in the Commission in Brussels the perfect scapegoat for all their lacks of satisfaction. Each time after a council where ministers would announce new provisions, there were those for whom there were too many provisions, those for whom there were not enough provisions, and one was always presenting the weaknesses as coming not from the decisions of the Council, but as coming from lacks in the services and in the technocracy. This does not mean that sometimes, and I wanted to say this to Jacques Delors this morning, but sometimes we were wondering if services are not just trying to build Europe for the sake of building Europe. I presided over a group of experts who talked about the free movement of people a few years ago, and I had the feeling, and I never get a response from the civil servants to the questions I was asking them, but I was wondering why to bring about a harmonization that was not really needed to guarantee the free movement of retirees. There were limitations that were put on the pensions and monies that retirees would receive for no real reason, and one did not know how many Europeans really wanted to use this new system. So we had to have a meeting among various departments of the Commission to find a much simpler solution, which enabled to satisfy the rules of free movement without having to change everything and to overhaul everything. In this climate, I would not qualify a climate of rejection towards Europe. I would not say that people had given up, but simply people were not quite as enthusiastic. They would let things be. But President Mitterrand and Chancellor Kohl and Jacques Delors, they were enthusiastic. They set things in motion once again. The Soviet Union was trying to subject Europe to its missiles and to obtain a sort of neutralization of the German Federal Republic by opposing the implementation of the US defense. The support that Mitterrand brought to Chancellor Kohl, and he was criticized by some on both sides of the Rhine, but this support was very important. The Soviet Union could no longer hope to divide the Europeans and to isolate them in relationship to the United States. The Europe came out of this crisis strengthened. It had stated its will to strengthen its economic capability and its internal market very quickly. And so it had a new thrust, and the Acte Unique, the single rule, was at the root of this, but it seemed once again to the United States that Europe would become a competitor for their markets. They never accepted this. They talked about fortresses, but actually Europe was only trying to concentrate more its economy, to regroup its private enterprise, and to bring and to make into a reality all the things that had been foreseen by the Treaty of Rome. But the attacks or the criticisms that were brought to bear by the United States, and they weren't the only ones, were very harsh. But actually, quite often, it was the Europeans who, because there were no longer borders inside Europe, had opened a very large market for their outside competitors, and they themselves did not benefit from reciprocity in the United States, for example. But these disputes were somewhat at the root of what would occur in the WTO. But new life came to Europe from the East, where nobody expected it. In August 1989, after the opening of the borders of Hungary, very quickly came the fall of the Berlin Wall, then the prospects of the unification of Germany, and this was a renewal. Rather than giving up to the institutional efforts that were considered, the European Council of December 1989 in Strasbourg decided to step up the reforms in order to face this new situation. All those who hoped, and there were many of those, that the fall of the Berlin Wall and the new freedom for Eastern European countries from the Soviet Union and communism would put an end to the idea of the European Union. Well, this was not the case. There were those who thought that we would be forced to give up Europe, a Europe that was already difficult to build at the time, and they considered that we would go towards a large zone of free trade, or that everybody would go back within their own borders and would no longer think about this project, which did not seem reasonable to them at all. A French minister said at the time that the fall of the Berlin Wall had only one victim, and this victim was Jacques Delors and maybe Europe as well. He was wrong, and that's a good thing. But one needed to take into account the hopes of the peoples who just had reached new freedom without having to resort to violence, and they hoped that Europe would help them to implement democracy and relaunch their economies through market economy. Even after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, the European responsibles or authorities did not know what to do. They wanted to welcome the new arrivals in the club of the richer countries, but these new arrivals were still victims of their recent past, and they had nothing, and so one did not know how to act. So the US reacted by opening to some of them the doors of NATO. And it is an accident of history, a tragical incident for them, and only that historical event had deprived them of a past which up to then had been very close to ours, a culture that was similar to ours. They needed to wait in order to come together with us, that they get a second prize, if you will. They could access the Council of Europe, which was very important to them, but they could not have access to what they had really hoped for. What one can regret today is that this Council of Europe, which existed that had for some time, that had been created thanks to Churchill, this Council of Europe, which was actually the lesser organization when compared to the European Union as it developed. This Council of Europe was the perfect instrument to welcome these countries if one readapted it, if one developed, amongst other things, political cooperation, which was what those countries were striving for.
I remember back in 1990, I advocated with Catherine Lalumière for this matter in Strasbourg and in Paris as well. And the Prague conference, where President Mitterrand presented his confederation plan. Unfortunately, we never were heard. All of this was accepted, but Prague was really under the yoke of the Soviet Union that had not yet imploded. And then this big map, the vision of it that French diplomacy wanted, was sufficient to show that the threat was still very much there. And so Havel, we understand why he was afraid of all of this. So no confederation, but no change to European Council either. It stayed as it was, and the new countries were very happy to come in. And today they find a forum for free speech there, and a lot of people are satisfied with the way things are. And there are the political issues that are of interest to the new arrivals from Eastern and Central Europe, but it's also because of the European Convention on Human Rights and jurisdiction, which provides guarantees for observing human rights that the European Human Rights Court oversees compliance with this. So that there's a lot of jurisdictional work to be done here. The only fear we have is to determine in the future how will the work go in the Luxembourg Court and in the European Council. But we can't deny that through this, it might seem somewhat narrow, but at least Eastern European countries have gotten into Europe. Nevertheless, through all these years, we have to admit, I can think of the years between 1985 and 1999. We were resigned to division, and we weren't working together in terms of the attempts that all of these countries made, that all of the people in the countries made to be more together. Occasionally, there was revolt that woke us up and brought us to the call, that provided some solidarity, that it was there in principle, but not much more. For the last 10 years, considerable sacrifices have been asked of the citizens of these countries since the fall of the Berlin Wall and freedom to comply with our standards, the standards that we've set, that are ours, but sometimes they are unacceptable because these countries are lagging behind in many ways. For example, in the environment. The recent Nice meeting set deadlines, but there's a door that's opening. And it could help us, but contrary to what others feel, and we know that there have been quite a few debates in France and in other countries about this because treaties have not yet been ratified in many countries, I feel that despite the flaws in the Nice Agreement, that it's great to be able to say, here we go, finally, these countries might be able to consider what the future is all about for them. But this outlook should be seen as a stroke of luck and not as a burden, because all of the work that we've done to have them be part of us, we need to make sure that they come to fruition. These decisions need to be made soon. For countries that are waiting, they despair, and for us too, citizens in the current European Union, we really need to open our eyes, finally, to the risks, the dangers, to the changes that have come about in the last 10 years or so, and we have to understand what the consequences are. The European Union, in any case, will not be the European Union that we designed, well, 50 years ago, even before the Treaty of Rome, through the Schuman Declaration, which already contained everything about building Europe that was in the treaty a few years later. The founding fathers were unable to imagine how much things could change in 50 years, especially when so many things happen. So we need to adjust our Europe to the future even more. In Europe, geography, history coincide, and this is good. It means that we'll need new institutions that take into account the number and the diversity, and especially the experiences and the hopes of the future members. Deprived of their national identity for decades, these people want to affirm this once again, and they are not prepared to renounce their nationalism or regionalism, but what they do want, as many of the citizens in our countries want, these people want to become citizens of Europe. The rise in xenophobia and racism is a problem, and there are demagogues who understand all of this. The whole world is known a great upheaval, and what role can Europe and what role must Europe play? There needs to be a balance in nuclear terror, and there are more frequent crises that are more difficult to solve. Europe has to be there and has to speak up with the United States in terms of the economy and in terms of the military is growing in the United States. We must do something. And a lot of people are very anti-globalization, and people fear this, and they're thinking about the United States being dominant here. Of course, in terms of the future, we have to think about China, India, and other countries that will be playing a greater and greater role in terms of this big planet that we live on. But it's up to Europe to do something too, and Europe needs to be heard more. International instruments that we've had since the UN started must be able to operate equitably and effectively in everyone's interest. For future generations, and I will limit myself to this one example, protecting the environment is a major challenge that no country can underestimate. Even if countries don't feel threatened, they will not be able to escape regulation. So in this area, solidarity and reason force us to work together. On this planet that's become a village, no one country can move ahead without taking all the other countries into consideration. Disease, poverty, environment, all of this pertains to every one of us. Of course, there are climate issues, and we're talking about global warming. All of this pertains to every one of us. So it's with this new landscape that Europe needs to find new ambitions and needs to find a new future for the 21st century. Europe needs to be brave and needs to understand the facts of life in the world today and tomorrow too. And it will have to be attentive to the hopes and the needs. Sometimes they sound contradictory. Globalization is a fact that we cannot ignore. It requires greater unity, greater strength, but individuals also want to preserve their own traditions, their culture, their past, whether they're national or regional. They want the benefit of all of this, and Europeans are also very much attached to solidarity, to dignity. They want to be protected from poverty and disease. And they ask the government to help them to guarantee this solidarity. And with racism, intolerance, xenophobia, there needs to be a majority that understands and that complies with ethics, that shares knowledge, that shares wealth. All of this is about the European identity and the European model. Much has already been done. In the next few months, more will be done. And it has more to do with our own pocketbooks than what's going on in the stock markets, actually. And we've made progress also in security, and citizens understand this, and they understand what Europe might be able to do for them. There is a lot to be done together still, to strengthen, to progress. Nothing's ever completed, especially in a world that's changing so rapidly. Civilized Europe, which over the past century has proven that it can be very barbaric, needs to understand the crises of the past, to move into the 21st century reconciled with itself, proud of its values, interested in making itself heard as a loyal partner of the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One of the advantages of having so many distinguished guests from abroad is that they attract distinguished guests at home. Our next speaker is Stephen Breyer, Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Justice Breyer was born in San Francisco, graduated from Stanford, then Oxford, then the Harvard Law School. He then joined the faculty of the Harvard Law School. He's the author of several books, numerous articles on administrative law and economic regulation. He served the government in several capacities, including Assistant Special Prosecutor on the Watergate Special Prosecution Force in 1973. He served on the United States Court of Appeals and was nominated by President Clinton to the Supreme Court and confirmed almost unanimously. I guess this is in 1994. He's described by one observer as pragmatic. He avoids the cliches of either conservative or liberal positions, and with a gift for clear language. Sir.
S'il parle de la langue, je vais dire quelque chose en français. Pas beaucoup, parce que je ne veux pas vous subjuguer à mon français.
But my French isn't very
Je veux
good.
faire un petit préface,
I want to make a short preface in
Et
French.
si je ne parle pas français parfaitement,
And if
je
I
vous
don't speak
assure
French
qu'il y en a
perfectly,
qui disent
I
je ne
can
parle pas
promise you
anglais non plus.
that there are a lot of people who say my English isn't all that great either.
Mais ce que je veux dire,
But what I
est
can
que
say
naturellement c'est un honneur
is naturally, and this is an honor,
d'être ici, et
to be here,
dans cette
to be here with you
aussi, Monsieur
in
Delors,
this conversation
ce
with
matin,
Mr. Delors
et,
this morning,
La Lumière et
Madame La
des
Lumière,
visiteurs
too,
distingués.
all
Mais
these
c'est plus
distinguished
que
guests.
cela.
But it's more than
Parce
that,
que je crois que c'est
because
un honneur
I believe that it's an
pour
honor
nous, Américains,
for us, Americans,
d'avoir ici,
to have here
aux États-Unis,
in the U.S.
tant des visiteurs
so many
français
French
pour
visitors
discuter
to
du
discuss
sujet de l'Europe.
the subject of
C'est
Europe.
une occasion.
This is
Et je
an
dis cela
opportunity.
parce que j'ai entendu
And
que
I'm
de
saying
Gaulle, le
it
général
because,
de Gaulle,
first of all, I
il
know
a
that
dit à un
General de
certain
Gaulle
point
said at one time
que l'Angleterre
that England,
est
to
le
discuss
sujet de l'Europe.
the subject of
C'est
Europe.
une occasion.
This is
Et je
an
dis cela
opportunity.
parce que j'ai entendu
And
que
I'm
de
saying
Gaulle, le
it
général
because,
de Gaulle,
first of all, I
il
know
a
that
dit à un
General de
certain
Gaulle
point
said at one time
que l'Angleterre
that England
est une île.
is an island,
L'Europe
Europe
est une péninsule.
is a peninsula,
Mais
but
Amérique,
America
c'est un autre monde.
is a whole different world.
Et très bien, vous avez décidé
So
de
fine.
visiter cet
You've
autre monde.
decided to come and visit this
Et
whole
c'est
different world.
important
And it's important
parce que
because
on pense aujourd'hui
today we
qu'il y
think
a des barrières,
that there
des
are
barrières de
barriers
distance,
of
des
distance,
barrières de
barriers of
temps,
time,
et les barrières
and barriers
de langue.
of language.
Et il faut rompre
And we
ces
have
barrières.
to break
Et
down
le
these
fait
barriers.
que vous êtes ici,
And the fact that you're
aux
here in the
États-Unis,
U.S.,
en français ou en anglais,
whether you speak in French or in English, when you're talking about Europe, this is important because it shows that these barriers are not as important as we might think. So, those are the reasons why I believe that it's wonderful that you're here. And now I'll start speaking in English.
what I was asked to do, which I will do, it's a little, well, it's from a judge's point of view, I'm not an expert in Europe, but I have been a judge for quite a while, and we do consider some of the issues that may in fact be relevant to the European situation. So having listened to Madame Veil, I pick out three aspects of what I think of she's driving at in part about the European identity. She aims, of course, as does the integration aim, at peace. But in fact, there are subsidiary parts that make that up. And so the three that I've chosen that I think present some concrete issues in respect to which our experience might be relevant are the classical notion that the identity of the European, in part, in this instance, is a function of having a common market, goods and services, that will move freely between countries. The second thing I want to mention is the simple fact, which leads to these and many other conferences, that that has been embodied in a highly complex set of institutions. And those institutions include a court, but those institutions are primarily interested in dividing powers in many different ways. horizontally among institutions of the European Union, vertically between the European Union and member states. Put all that under the title subsidiarity. That's not a perfect title because it's much more than that, but it carries an idea that I'll discuss briefly. The third, which is becoming more important all the time, is to focus upon the common values of Europeans as embodied in protections of basic human rights. Now, those three are not the whole story by any means, but they are three I've picked out to raise in each area a question. And the question is far less grand than the subject. The question is simply how the courts in this new set of institutions, now not so new, but how they're going to answer certain problems that arise in each area. So let me turn to my one question that exists under the area of the traditional free market for goods and services. There, of course, there is a European court in Luxembourg which acts as a referee. And a basic question that it is refereeing is the following. How do you decide whether a particular country's law is in fact a justified effort to regulate local environment, local health, local safety, local cultural values, or an unjustified effort to be a trade barrier to trade between the member states? That is a classical question that the European Court has answered many, many times in concrete circumstances, balancing Article 30 versus Article 36. And the only question that our court's experience raises in that area is the following. We answer the same question many, many times. Typical case. I exaggerated a little. But the state of New Hampshire passes a law to prevent trucks with dynamite from driving through the local town except at 2 in the morning. Now, is that an effort to protect the safety of the citizens while they're walking the street? Or is it an effort to protect the local manufacturers of dynamite? They did something quite similar with fish. Were they trying to protect the New Hampshire fish breeders from disease? Or were they trying to protect the New Hampshire fish breeders from the disease called competition? Well, we answer questions like that frequently. And the point that I want to make is we often get them wrong. What happens when we get them wrong? How do I know we get them wrong? The way I know is because Congress passes a statute that changes the result that the court came up with. And if that isn't good enough, sometimes what happens is Congress delegates the authority to change what the court did to an administrative agency, which has only one advantage. They actually know about fish, and we don't. So the question this poses for your experience is, what is the comparable way to revise the decisions of your court in Luxembourg when it decides a fish question or a dynamite question or a question labeling pasta or indeed, what is it, the liquor from Dijon? All right. The cassis de Dijon, oui. C'est très bien, ce cassis, excellent. What is ironic about this, though I think the problem I raise is pretty well known, is of course the more worried citizens of certain countries are about delegating authority to the Council, i.e. to the Commission, the harder they make it for the Council, acting on the advice of the Commission, to enact a rule, i.e. a change. And the less the power that they give to the Council, to change its rules, the more the power they give to the court to make its rules permanent. Because, of course, if you cannot change the court's rules easily, then it is their decision as to cassis de Dijon, pasta. You know, I think there's something to the Italian position there. Durum wheat pasta is really quite different than that, but in any case, I'll leave aside the discussion of the merits. But you see the point. So this is a question that our experience raises. Second area, I will pick out one question that our experience raises. Let us take the issue of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity, do we have a principle like that? Sort of. When our Constitution was written, there was a fairly clear division of powers between states and federal government, a division that was embodied in the Commerce Clause, for example, giving Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce, a power that is expanded dramatically. And I can only speak for my view. As one judge, I can't speak for the entire court. But I think that that power has expanded dramatically, not so much because of changes in the law, but because of changes in the world. Which is to say, in today's world, things that occur in Des Moines do affect the citizen of Tampa, just as what occurs in Naples really does affect, or could well affect, what goes on in Oslo. That's a change in the world. But given that change in the world, the commerce power has expanded out of necessity, I think. And indeed, you, with your principle of subsidiarity, will try to sort out what goes where. And my question, which arises out of my experience, is can a court do that? Our court is in the midst of an argument about the meaning of the Commerce Clause. But at least in my view, whatever the rights and wrongs of the argument in particular cases, and indeed these issues are very difficult, we are at the fringes of the heart of what Congress does. We can trim a little bit one way or another depending on how those cases come out. But basically, the legal authority is vast, whoever wins that particular argument. And that means that the division of power, in fact, between states and federal government primarily rests in the hands of Congress and the states. For they decide, in the context of individual laws, by and large, what they want to do. And they very normally respect states' rights when they do it. But now, how will you resolve that? My question there, which is a somewhat pejorative question, is can you rely on the courts to sort it out for you? The pejorative part being, I doubt it. Third question, now the area of common values or basic human rights. 2 or 3 things are going on, my experience suggests, or my reading suggests, in Europe at the same time. The expansion of the authority of your court, Madame la Lumière, in Strasbourg, and the court in Luxembourg, perhaps, depending on whether there are decisions one way or the other, to write certain kinds of statutes containing basic rights. And I think your experience might bear out, but mine does very much, that once you entrust the court with the power to protect human rights, 2 kinds of cases come up. One kind I will call the easy case. There are many cases where the deprivation of human rights is clear and obvious on its face. And although there are always arguments, the vast consensus of people of our generation, a little younger, probably a little older, is that there is a violation. Indeed, it's serious, and something should be done. But there is another kind of case, and all the other category I will simply describe as really difficult close case, often with great commercial implications. For example, the case of whether Congress could enact a law which requires cable television systems to carry over-the-air broadcasters had First Amendment free expression implications, and whether they could or could not turned into a First Amendment constitutional decision, which our court decided by a vote of 5-4, the arguments on the two sides being extremely close. And then again, in today's world, we have cases where new technology puts rights of privacy into conflict with rights of free expression. Indeed, machines that might pick up, say, through wiretaps, that was yesterday. Through sound bouncing off windows, that's today. Communications that are going on beyond the barrier, and then printed perhaps in the newspaper. Rights of expression, rights of privacy. How will they be decided? Reasonable people in many of those cases can reach different conclusions on the same difficult but very important matter with tremendous implications both for the economy and, what may be more important, for the basic rights of the individual. So hence my question. Which court in Europe will have the last word? That we've worked out here. But I bring my close cases to your attention to point out that reasonable people can differ. And unless there are authoritative ways of resolving the issue, confusion, conflict can result. Now, I see from my reading, not from my experience, that it is not clear in Europe in certain areas. I like very much, because of the intellectual complexity, the problem in France, which I think arises because an ordinary court in France cannot hold unconstitutional a particular law of the National Assembly once it has been enacted. And yet sometimes a law that seemed constitutional could have unconstitutional implications. So there, I gather, what the French lawyers will do is say, we're telling you this violates, wait, what does it violate? If they say it violates the French Constitution, they cannot win. So they say it violates the Convention on Human Rights, or perhaps the Treaty of Rome, Maastricht, depending on other things. And now what we have is the French judge deciding a matter of European law on words that are the same, really, as those written in the French Constitution, where the final word will be given not necessarily by a French judge, but a judge in Strasbourg, and we hope authoritatively, unless, of course, there's another authoritative decision that comes out of Luxembourg or some other place. And I say some other place because the constitutional courts of Germany and of Italy have made certain reservations about when they might have the last word in constitutional matters. So, a question. In any case, what I've done is raise 3 questions to which I don't have answers. Our experience may or may not be relevant, but I lead those technical details, and they are, to you to consider in light of the undeniably valuable objectives of European citizenship that Madame Veil mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice Breyer. Our next speaker is another distinguished French civil servant turned politician, born in the Basses-Pyrénées at Pau, graduate of Sciences Po and l'ENA, served in numerous administrative positions, was elected a deputy in 1986 from the Pyrénées-Atlantiques. 1989, went to the European Parliament, where he served, among other things, as president of the commission that oversees the budget. From 1993 to 1995, he served within the Foreign Ministry as the Minister for European Affairs. Alain Lamassoure.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chairman.
Nous devons traiter d'un sujet très ambitieux.
This is quite an ambitious topic, how to govern an enlarged Europe. And as the speaker before me,
soulèverai trois questions
I
sans
have
apporter de
three
réponse.
questions to ask and no answers for them.
Étant donné que on nous apprend dans nos grandes écoles qu'une question bien posée est à 80% réglée.
We learn that when one asks a question right, then that's 90% of the answer to the question as well.
Nous sommes devant cette tâche historique
qui
va consister à essayer de gouverner un ensemble de 25 ou 30 pays
25 or 30 countries in a few years,
qui sera, comme le suggère Jacques Delors,
and as Jacques Delors has said, and this is something that is now repeated by many European leaders, this will be a federation of European states. This will be a new political beast, a federation of sovereign states. So my three issues are as follows. First, there is a misunderstanding, then there is a revolution, and then there is a taboo. Allow me to explain myself. What is the misunderstanding? I believe that many of our American friends are ill at ease when we talk about the European Union, the European construct, the European evolution, and they ask, well, when will this come to an end? When will they come to their final formula? And this is a question that we wonder about as well. I am a grandfather, and I explained to my grandchildren that maybe 50 years from now something else will occur. Well, where are we now in the building of Europe? And there is what I call the misunderstanding. That is to say, the discrepancy that there is between what the leaders think and what the leaders do, and what the public opinion thinks and the reality of things. For the European leaders, Europe is a topic which is far away in the horizon, and this horizon moves further and further away as one seems to get closer to it. It is a topic that one talks about briefly to show that one is a visionary, but on which one does not act, because one wants to show that one is also realist. So for European leaders, Europe is the priority of those who will come after us. And I observe that if I believe what has been said, amongst other things this morning by Mr. Brzezinski and also by the ambassador, for the American leaders, the situation is similar. The European Union is something that will be very useful from a historic point of view, and we hope that it will occur, but under those who will come in power after us. And between now and then, if things are problematic, well, it's not a problem. That's the attitude of the leaders, but for public opinion, the situation is very different. And I would like here to contradict false information that one can see in newspapers and that is repeated by the political leaders, according to which European public opinions are less strongly interested in European policies than the leaders. The leaders say, well, if it were up to me, I would do this and that, but I have to take into account public opinion. But the reality is not such. On the European continent, I cannot talk about what you talked about, Mr. Judge, when you talked about an island. It's something different. We talk about Europe.
Au sens où on emploie ce mot dans l'île.
In the sense in which one considers the word Europe in this island. So every 6 months we have surveys in all of Europe, which we call Eurobarometers, we asked the man on the street in Europe on various aspects of European policies. And there was a survey, the most recent one in December, when the European summit was going on in Nice. And what one sees is that in all of the countries of the Union, those who believe that in the future the European Union will have a much more important role to play than it does today, those people are there are many more people who believe that than people who believe the opposite. So people believe that the European construct will have a much more important role to play in the future. Those who wish to see this happen are happy. Who are happy about this is 3 times greater than those who fear this evolution. When we talk about federation or when we talk about federal Europe, more than 50% of European citizens are in favor of this, with a high rate in Spain, 56%, a high rate in France, and this is interesting, 55%, because it's interesting because France has had 13 political regimes over the last 2 centuries, and the federal regime is the only one it hasn't had. And the rate is lower in Germany, which is a federal country. It's only 41% in Germany. What is interesting is that 2 European citizens out of 3 do not trust the current European institutions. And this morning, Mr. Brzezinski was saying with strength that the difference between a European citizen and an American citizen is that when one asks an American citizen how things work, who governs America, he can say he has an opinion. And when one asks a European, nobody knows. There are very few Europeans, only a few experts in institutions who have an answer to this. So the European citizens are not happy about the way things go. They do not trust the European Parliament, the Tribunal, or the Commission. But what is interesting is that, except for the UK, nobody trusts their own government, trusts that their own government could lead the European Union either. And finally, 7 Europeans out of 10 consider that the moment has come to write a real constitution of the European Union, and that the treaty, the use of a treaty, is a formula that no longer corresponds to our political needs for today. This is a debate that puts us in opposition to Jacques Delors. He said that a good treaty is better than a bad constitution, said like that. Well, we agree, but the treaties get worse and worse. So a bad constitution is better than the worst of treaties. And I think that the Treaty of Nice is a very bad treaty. And that is what believe 70% of Europeans. Even in the UK now, and even in Denmark, 59% are in favor of this position. So the idea of a European constitution, which seemed a utopia 2 years ago, has now become something that is obvious, and it's an idea which is maturing. So this is what the public opinion thinks, and this is what the leaders do. Now, what are the reality of things? Well, the reality of things is that the European Union is a political union. There are many laws. A European citizen respects 2 laws, national laws and European laws, and Europe is responsible for roughly 50% of the laws under which European citizens live. When compared to the traditional role of a traditional federation such as the US, well, the situation is very different. We did things in opposite order. Instead of starting with foreign relations, we started with agricultural policies. I won't come back on the reasons for this, but we now have more technical than political and democratic institutions because they were conceived to support the Treaty of Rome, which was just a commercial agreement in 1957. These institutions were made more complex, but they weren't transformed. So we have the strange example of 15 democracies who are democracies without power in their own country to govern their own countries. But they have built together a common political beast, which is not very political, not very transparent, and not very effective. That was my first comment. So there is the misunderstanding. The second issue is the revolution in numbers. We will not go from 15 to 30 without deeply changing, without totally changing the system. For cultural reasons that were quite well explained by Simone Veil, and I won't come back on this, the Eastern countries will bring to us a different tradition, a different culture, which we will have to take into account. But also there is just the rule of numbers. So there will be a twofold revolution. As regards to the decision-making process, the more countries there are, the more we will have to be integrated, the more we will have to operate on a federal level. That is the paradox of numbers. When there were only 6 countries at the beginning, we could admit that decisions were only made once one had reached a unanimity. There were six neighboring countries with common traditions and cultures, and so they could decide things unanimously. When there will be 30 countries, to say that decisions are reached unanimously, this is to say that nothing will ever be decided upon. At the time of Europe of 12 countries, which was a sizable number, it took us 15 years to agree on a single definition of what jam was. There was a historic compromise. I had my role to play in this. There was the ordinary jam, the current jam, the extra jam, and then one country that is an island said, all I know is marmalade, I don't know jam. And so we admitted marmalade, and then there was Alsatia, the region, Strasbourg in France, next to Germany, who said, well, we have a type of jam that translated literally is called scratch ass. It's not a very poetic name, but so we said there's the normal jam, the extra jam, marmalade, and the scratch ass jam. You laugh, that means that you're not taking me seriously. But when we tried to reach an agreement for a statute of a European corporation, we agreed unanimously just before Nice in December 2000, after 30 years of negotiation. And as regards the single market, since January 1, 1993, there are no longer border controls of people in the borders between France, Germany, Italy, Spain, etc. But there are still controls at the air borders. The air is still divided in 15 zones. Why? Because a dispute on Gibraltar between the UK and Spain. So that's completely absurd. That is this, which means that to decide something unanimously when there are 30 contenders is to say that nothing will be decided. So a larger Europe will be a federal Europe or will not exist in its decision-making system. However, the other consequence, which is contradictory, another consequence of the revolution in numbers, is that because of the principle of subsidiarity, there will be fewer decisions to make, because the more countries there are, the more there are topics of common interest. There are many topics of common interest between France and Germany, but between Ireland and Bulgaria or Spain and Estonia, there are less common interests than between Belgium and the Netherlands. So, therefore, there will be a redistribution of competencies within which the European Union will have one of the traditional roles that are given at a federal role, such as defense and foreign policy. And for that, Europe will have to go to the end of its logic. But conversely, other responsibilities will have to go back to the member states when there will be more states in the Union. And then let me talk about what is taboo. The European identity that was very well described by Simone Veil and which was mentioned this morning by one of the people who asked a question and said, why doesn't Europe try to have a cultural identity, a European personality? Well, a crucial element so for this identity to come to be, and in order to enable us to master an enlarged Europe, is to define the limit, to define the list of the members of the club, who could eventually become part of the Union, part of this club. And there is not a misunderstanding, but there is a lack of definition which becomes more and more problematic. Since the Treaty of Rome, it has been admitted that the community and then the Union was open to all democratic European countries. And the academics here will be satisfied by this, because it seems that political science seems to be a more precise science than geography, because we could define what was a democracy according to the criteria of Copenhagen, but we couldn't define what was a European state. So everybody was surprised, and some were despairing, myself included, because there was a decision taken in December 1999 by the European Council in Helsinki that said that Turkey could potentially become a member. This means that the geographical concept is no longer one of the conditions to belong to the European Union. And geography, even though it might not be perfect, is the only criteria which should not offend any state which decides to join the Union. All other criteria, historical, economic, cultural, religious, is a criterion which could offend some, so it cannot be stated. Turkey is only barely a European country, and if one admits Turkey, then one cannot say no to other candidates. And 8 days later, Ukraine and Moldova were candidates. 1 month later, there was a speech made by the young king of Morocco, who repeated what his father had said 10 years before, and he said, the day there will be a tunnel under Gibraltar, then Morocco can become part of the European Union. And the Dominican Republic is a candidate to membership. They said that geographically they are between two French islands in the Caribbean, so that nothing goes against their joining the Union. We read less than a month ago in Bild am Sonntag a letter from the Israeli president who said that he was speaking personally, but he said that the future of Israel was joining the European Union. And who amongst us can say that Israel is not a European country, that Israel has no relationship to Europe? And of course, the day when Armenia will explain to us that it is also a European Union, who amongst us can say no? And the day when Russia will say that it's a European country, who amongst us can say that Russia is less a European country than Turkey? So this may be a very interesting political project, but it's no longer Europe. It's no longer our Europe, at least. So it's a debate. It's a discussion that I had with Miss Albright a few months ago, and she considered that it was obvious that Turkey should become member of the European Union, given the strategic role of Turkey, and saying, well, it is the best way that you have to consolidate in Turkey the forces for Europe and democracy. And I said, yes, but then I'm sure that you will propose that Mexico, that is a country that needs to have its democratic regime strengthened and its economy strengthened, and given its strategic situation, well, then it should become one of the 50 states of the United States. This proposal seems crazy. The proposal on Turkey is just as crazy to us, Europeans. And actually, Turkey, just as Russia, just as the North African countries, has the same kind of relationship than the United States has with Mexico and Canada. Of course, these are countries that are privileged partners. They are close friends of our family, but they are not members of the family. Because if we admit them in the family, it means that first, we don't know how we're going to govern a large Europe with 30, but if Europe goes up to Vladivostok, then our whole identity will disappear, and one needs to be reasonable. It is a historical mission to reconcile 30 European countries and to make them work together within a single federation, and it would not be reasonable to consider going beyond this. And my last comment will be to come back to what I said at the outset. when I said, where do we stand now? Well, it took roughly 10 years to the young American Union to go from an ineffective confederation to the Convention of Philadelphia. And it will have taken us a few decades, but we are still between the two. And we are trying to strive to be able to convene a convention such as the Philadelphia Convention. We do not have an incident such as the conflict that occurred between Virginia and Maryland of navigation on the Potomac, but we need an incident of this type. Thank you.
I'm thinking of having a break, but let's maybe one more talk and then we'll have a break. Our next speaker, Jan Eliasson, the Swedish ambassador, of course, has the great advantage now of speaking as Mr. Europe. And he will, of course, in his present position, have to defend all the acquis communautaire and existing institutions of the community. He was born in Göteborg. He's a graduate of the Swedish Naval Academy and was an exchange student in Indiana. He's had a long diplomatic career: Paris, Bonn, Washington, and Zimbabwe. He has been the Swedish ambassador to the United Nations and also the first Undersecretary for Humanitarian Affairs at the United Nations, served as the Secretary General's personal representative on Iran and Iraq in the years 88 through 92, and he has been ambassador here since the year 2000. He also taught as a visiting professor at the University of Uppsala. Ambassador, very nice to have you here.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'll speak with three hats: Swedish ambassador, and secondly, which you referred to, Mr. Chairman, Sweden representing the European Union presidency this first half of 2001. And thirdly, an irresponsible participant at this academic conference, which I enjoy to attend. One reason that you possibly mentioned Göteborg, Gothenburg, which may be a city most of you don't know, is that in June this year, President Bush will visit this city for the European Union-US summit, where I hope with that we will manifest the transatlantic relationship in the spirit that our speakers this morning and this afternoon have spoken. You notice the rubric, the headline of this part of the seminar about the new European Union. There are 5 words, and I've picked out those 5 words, and I'll try to say a few things in about 2 minutes on each. The words in this session are visions, membership, culture, structures, and identities. It's true. You look at the program and you'll see that. So let's start with the vision thing. We heard this morning Jacques Delors speak about the importance of the European Union achieving credibility historic credibility. We heard Brzezinski speak about the need for an emotional commitment from the Europeans to the European Union project. I would venture 2 ideas on the vision. One, a strong Europe, but I would add to this, with the definition of strong in the post-Cold War sense. I don't want in any way to diminish the role of the military and the security side that we have to deal with, and I think there we have to look very much at NATO. But I would like to say at the end of the Cold War that strength is something that we should define in new dimensions. And I would hope this would be Europe's definition of strength. Strength in today's world should be economic strength, according to my values, well distributed. Strength should be social cohesion in a society. Strength should be environmental balance. Strength should be the vitality of our democracies. Strength should be societies with young people who believe in the future. And strength for European Union, I hope, although we aren't the perfect model of this, particularly in the area of trade, agriculture. The European Union should be an open entity, and open to the outside world, and of course open and transparent also to our own citizens. The other part of the vision, in my view, would be the peace, the contribution of the European Union to peace. In the same way as Simone Veil spoke about the coal and steel union and what that reflected, basically to make war impossible between Germans and French. This new challenge for Europe at this age is to make war impossible between what was earlier the countries on one side of the shameful wall and those countries were on the other one. And that by the creation of interdependence and sharing of values across that wall that is now gone, we would make war impossible in the same way as was done in the 50s between Germany and France, between those countries who were only 15, 20 years ago facing each other, as Hans Sonnenfeld knows, with tremendous numbers of nuclear weapons and mass armies. That's the vision. A strong Europe with a new definition, post-Cold War definition, and European Union as a contribution to peace in the spirit of enlargement. And that brings me to the second word, namely membership. What is going on now is negotiations with 12 countries, candidate countries. Turkey has not yet started the negotiations. I think after having listened to Alain Lamassoure, you all understand why this may take some time. It's not, we still have criteria to be followed, and they're going to be followed very closely, although we hope very much that Turkey once will join the Union, of course. These 12 countries will enter the European Union, not as sometimes is discussed in the discussions about NATO enlargement with a big bang, but they will have to perform. Each country will be judged individually to how they adapt both to the, how they follow both the Copenhagen criteria, democracy, human rights and rule of law, but also how they fulfill the reform efforts and how they conduct the negotiations in a tremendous number of concrete areas, because it really has to do with integration of a whole society into a union. And that might take some time. But those negotiations, they have a very strong role in pushing for reform. Many of the countries who are now in the candidate group are concerned that the negotiations are going too slowly. But I think the very fact still that there is a process and they know there is a goal and objective will have a very positive effect on reform. What we hope is to finish the first round of negotiations at the end of 2002, the round with the first group of countries at the end of 2002. And then with ratification procedures, we could and should be able to receive the first members of the new in the enlarged European Union by the middle of 2004, maybe in time for the European Parliament election 2004. To some, this might sound like an optimistic scenario, but I still think that is in the spirit we work after the Nice agreement. Still, I would say that this perspective, not perhaps of membership, because it's unrealistic in some of the cases that, again, Alain Lamassoure mentioned, but I still think that, for instance, in the Balkans, and I myself worked in the Balkans last year with the Stability Pact, I was there very much. When finally Milosevic disappeared, there was a hope in this whole region that in a future, which is still a far way off, these countries also belong in a larger European Union. We are now talking to these countries mostly in terms of partnership and cooperation agreements. We'll see what happens, but I think it is a very important aspect of European integration that countries in this war-torn area, this trauma of Europe, also have a hope for the future. Without that hope, we may risk having those terrible explosions occurring with a regularity that is scaring. And I think these days when we see events in Macedonia, we are reminded of that. Third word, culture. Simone Veil reminded us that European history is both a history of great beauty, great cultural richness, but also with some of the greatest and worst barbarities that have occurred in human history. And maybe we should draw some lessons from that in Europe and take out the best of our traditions, best of our culture, and put that into that identity, that European culture of which we should be proud. I would hope that that boils down to standing up very strongly for that community of values which European Union must represent: democracy, human rights, rule of law. Also to the openness. When I talk about culture, I must, of course, remind you of Shakespeare, Verona, in Romeo and Juliet, when the friar reminds Romeo that there is a world outside Verona. And I think if we in Europe, and by the way also the United States, forget that there is a world outside Verona, we are in trouble. And this openness should characterize what I hope will be a strong future European Union. We have a great challenge here and a great difficulty, and I must reflect just 20 seconds on that. And that is the issue of migration and integration of other cultures. Europe is a multicultural, multi-ethnic continent, and growingly so. Sweden has 10% of Swedish population are foreign-born. A large percent of our people are now with Muslim faith. There is a problem. We need these people, and I say it in an almost economic term. Any calculation shows that Europe needs labor and actually needs to receive, there are figures up to 30 to 50 million people in the next 15, 20 years if we are to maintain our growth. But there are also, let's face that, great challenges, great strains in European political life. We know movements also among young people who are very scary, and which are fed also very much, unfortunately, on the migration and some of the aspects of migration. If you go around the big cities in Europe and look at the schools in the suburbs, you may see what I mean. And I think we have to face up to that as one of the major challenges for European integration. A fourth word, structures. If we are to enlarge the European Union, of course there have to be changes. I think this is very welcome indeed. There are those who are very scared that we now go into this and that we will have an absolutely impossible entity to govern. And of course it will be an impossible entity to govern if we don't reform. And therefore we have to, of course, look very deeply, which is already started in Nice at the latest, but it will continue, on how decisions are being made, qualified majority vote, etc. And also what is called enhanced cooperation or flexible integration. I will not be too technical, but the possibility of some countries going a bit faster than others so that we are not following the principle of lowest common denominator in European integration. Also, I may say, and I say this also very openly and self-critically, we have to reform the European agricultural policies. I don't speak thinking about these apocalyptic pictures of burning cattle in Europe now, but maybe it will serve as a reminder still that this whole area has to be studied and reformed. Half of the budget to the European Union is subsidies to the agricultural sector. It has a distorting effect, this overproduction, on trade, on relations to the new countries that will be members of the European Union and the developing countries. And it's, by the way, in many cases not good for the consumers in Europe. So we have to take a critical look at the agricultural policies in Europe. Last point, last word, identities. My father was a labor union leader in Sweden. And when I was studying, I said that I was going out, taking a train, as we did in that generation, into Europe. And he said, Europe, what is that? And I said, well, yeah, Europe is where I said where I was going. London, Paris. London was to be Europe and is to be Europe. Paris, Rome, Madrid, And then my father said, do you think, is that Europe? I said, well, what do you say? If you forget, young man, he told me, this labor union leader, no education really. I'm the first one to graduate in my family. If you think that Europe is not Krakow and Prague, you haven't understood what Europe is all about. And that to me was a reminder of something very important, namely the fact that we in that generation should not accept that shameful wall. But it also reminded me of something else, that identities is really, and I like that about this seminar, it's a plural. One of the worst things in human history is that we too often have defined identity in singular. If we don't realize that we have an identity both in Göteborg or whatever hometown you have, your country, and in our case Europe, and I would hope all of you as an old UN ambassador or former UN ambassador, I hope I can say, in the global community, then we haven't realized that it's not a question of dividing humanity into we and they. If we accept that we have that identity on all levels, then of course we can't point to we or show the we and point to the they. And I think what we now are facing in Europe is being proud of our national identities. And I particularly think of my French friends. They will never forget their pride in the French culture, civilization, language, food. I can continue. But I also think we need to work on this European identity and create a sense around the European identity which brings out that word, the emotional commitment that Zbigniew Brzezinski spoke about. And my last remark would be that this strong Europe, in that post-Cold War definition that I gave, that Europe that is expanding, and the way that we hope that Europe is expanding with the openness to the outside world is also very much in the interest of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. One of the problems with a menu as rich as this one is the danger of indigestion. And of course, the time-honored French solution is to have a little Calvados or whatever to make a trou. I'm not sure we can offer you any Calvados, but maybe we could at least have a pause. May I suggest that we have a break and meet again promptly at 4, because we do still have a good deal to do. Thank you. Please. We have three more speakers, and then I would suggest that we take questions from the audience or discussion among the panelists. We will certainly be finished by 6 and perhaps sooner. This has been a long and very rich day, but we still have a bit more of it. Our next speaker is Francois Scheer, who's an ambassador of France, born in Strasbourg, a graduate of Sciences Po and l'ENA, joined the Quai d'Orsay, has served in numerous posts, been ambassador to Mozambique, to Swaziland. He has long been connected with the European community, the European Union. He has served as the French ambassador, or permanent representative, to the European community from '86 to '88. He also was a director de cabinet for Simone Veil, I see, when she was president of the European Parliament. He was Secretary General at the Quai d'Orsay from 88 to 92, and Ambassador to Germany from 93 to 99. Very pleased to have you here.
Je vous remercie. Depuis
Thank you.
le début de notre table ronde,
From the
je me
beginning of
posais la
this
question de
roundtable,
savoir
I have wondered
ce que j'allais pouvoir dire.
what I would be able to say.
J'avais le sentiment que tout le monde avait
Since
déjà tout dit.
I got the impression that everybody said everything before I came along. Fortunately, Europe is a Spanish inn, and everybody brings to it occasionally what he wants, and the debate just goes on, and that's fine. There are many things that you can say, and I will attempt to discuss a number of topics, and I'll try and say the contrary of what was said before me. I would like to come back to the identity issue because it is worthwhile to ask why today we are discussing this identity issue so much in our Europe. Because identity really wasn't of great concern to Europeans since we began to build Europe. And it's not based on an identity issue that one day we decided to work together to do what everyone previously had decided to do on his own. So you talk about identity and European identity. What is this? What's really missing today, in my opinion, in the construction of Europe is the dream component. Because from the beginning of building Europe, and this is a utopia, basically, but the facts today are the utopias of yesterday, and there are dreams, and there can be many reasons that were much less romantic. Today, there's no more reason to dream about Europe because we can't get Europeans to dream anymore about Europe. Today, in our Europe, there are politicians, there are no more governments that can get Europeans to dream about the future of their continent. This is undeniable. This is a major problem for continuing the European adventure. I believe that it is based on this lack of a dream. The feeling that Europeans have that at this time we're simply satisfied with managing day-to-day lives. And slowly but surely we're going to have to determine what Europe is and where it's going. And that is why I believe we've spoken so much for the past few years about identity. But no one ultimately is at this point able to provide a definition, a satisfactory definition of what European identity is. With all of her talent, Simone Veil a few minutes ago didn't totally give us the answer we were waiting for on this subject. And I believe that this is totally natural because my feeling is that identity is not something that you can define ahead of time. Identity is not something that you can preconceive. Identity, the identity of our European nations is something that is born slowly with the history of each people, and all of a sudden they find themselves together inside this international border. Identity can only be the result of a long adventure, and identity for me is the result of a long time of living together. And as long as Europeans haven't lived together for a long, long time, as long as Europeans haven't made the decision to understand that they are a community, then I believe that we will not have given the identity issue the proper answer. And the community, as I've been talking about today, I'm still very sad that we've given up on the word European community. European Union, in my opinion, doesn't really meet the needs of what Europe wants to be, what the peoples of Europe want to do together. In other words, it's a community that we want, something that didn't exist beforehand, something that has no precedent, something that is totally new on the European continent. I believe that this word community did a much better job of explaining the European dream than the term union, which, in my opinion, is much more commonplace. So, nevertheless, in this thinking about identity, there is the feeling that's come up, slowly but surely, that we Europeans we have a number of common values. And as you know, a group of VIPs, very eminent, was given the responsibility a few months ago of developing what we would call a charter of basic rights for the European Union. This charter is a whole, a system of recognized values that are common to the peoples of Europe. But if you look at all of this closely, what is part of all of this charter, then you will see that there's really nothing especially or exclusively European about it, because these values are values that you, the Americans, you can acknowledge as your own. And this seems obvious. These values that today are enshrined in Europe's common heritage, then it's come about slowly, through experience, through what all of this could be in our culture. They come from a very distant past, our Greek Judeo-Christian past. And all of this emerged very slowly in the Europe of the 16th century, the Renaissance. And slowly we saw all of this continue up to the U.S. Constitution, which was obviously the first document that took up all of these values in the Age of Enlightenment, and the Declaration of Human Rights and the French Revolution. These are the documents that really put together all of these values that altogether Europeans recognize as such. But is that enough for an identity? Obviously not. I believe that it's a good place to start. It's a great starting point for analysis. Slowly but surely it has enabled us to develop our idea of what democracy is and what a republic is, even if Europe is not really a bunch of republics grouped together, but even if we're all Republicans. It's these values that today we attach great importance to when we look at the upcoming candidates for the European Union. A few minutes ago, Alain Lamassoure raised the issue of Turkey. I don't have the same approach as he does at all to Turkey. As far as I'm concerned, it's the matter of whether Turkey should be part of the European Union or not, and that's an issue that will be based only on the Copenhagen criteria. It's based on these criteria that one day we will have to answer the question whether, yes or no, Turkey is worthy of being part of this European community. Perhaps Turkey may never become a part of the European Union. It might remain at the door or in the antechamber. But it is unthinkable that our Europe, one way or another, could not answer a question that for the stability of the European continent is essential. Is Turkey part of our environment, or should Turkey again move off on to more Eastern adventures for European stability, for European security and security in the Mediterranean? I think that would be a very bad thing, and I don't think that Mediterranean stability is insensitive to the U.S. But that's Turkey, that's a different story, and we could obviously talk about that for a long time. But I'd like to get back to the issue of values. So what do we need to do using these base values? What can we do to attempt to work to get Europe to move toward this idea of living together? I would say immediately that it's not going to be a constitution that will allow Europeans to convince themselves that they have to progress quickly toward a genuine community. As far as I'm concerned, the Constitution can only be the ultimate result. What we're attempting to do in order to enable the 15 or the 20 or the 30 of tomorrow, not just to live together, but to decide together about their destiny. Obviously, the Europe of 15 currently is stuck with an institutional issue. With 12, things more or less worked. At 15, it's not working anymore. Europe is stuck. And the obvious thing is that there needs to be institutional reform. This is a given. The problem is to determine what is this reform going to be. And all the reforms that we're considering now are reforms that will not solve the problems. Even if today we have succeeded in broadening the scope of the qualified majority, the problem will still not be solved. Why not? Because in Brussels, there is this cult of consensus in Brussels. Often we've said that Europe's operations were very much predicated on the French model. That's totally wrong. In France, we don't work on consensus. In Brussels, we work on consensus. In France, we still work on a very authoritarian mode. In Brussels, it's consensus, and that's much more German than French. And in this regard, in my long experience in the community, I only very rarely saw Europeans be brave enough to vote on something to determine whether there was a majority or not. Generally, we try and say that everybody agrees even if everybody isn't in an agreement. And personally, I am convinced that the decisions made with a qualified minority in Brussels were made simply because at one point in time, people refrained from voting, and we just pretended that everybody agreed. So, these are not the reforms that are really going to change things. And I very much agree with Alain Lamassoure that there will be no other constitutional system that can cause the community of notions and disparate people to work other than a federal system. This is a very taboo term in France. Lamassoure is part of a political movement that courageously adventured into this terrain and who still dares to say the word federal. But they have to be very cautious about saying that word. We prefer using the word federative, but nobody knows what that means. So I am totally convinced that we did not invent the best system to cause disparate communities to live together, a federal system. French people really don't know what a federal system is about. We are still very Jacobin, and we don't understand federalism. Except that today there's one thing that's obvious, and that is that in Europe, no one, including the federal states, are prepared to move toward a federal constitution, and especially not the Germans, because for years, they were the most fervent supporters of moving Europe toward federalism, up until the day when suddenly they came to the realization that building European federalism could ruin German federalism and its meaning. And the provinces, the Länder, the states that are part of the Federal Republic, they rebelled against this slow transfer of powers to Brussels. And that's why in the Amsterdam European Council, where we should have supplemented the Maastricht system, Chancellor Kohl decided not to go ahead with these reforms, and he stopped them in their tracks. And we put them on the agenda in Nice, but very incompletely, so that today no European state is prepared to go ahead toward federalism, which leads me to say that since the European Constitution can only be federal unless some European geniuses are able to invent a different system other than federalism, until we have arrived at the time when, through the strength of things, and because that will be the result of a natural movement, that we can put on the table a federal constitution, no other constitutional effort can be undertaken. And I believe we have to convince ourselves today that we will continue to attempt to build something that, in any case, institutionally, will only work as organization that limps along. And we can't build a modern Europe with Baroque mechanisms. What that means is that Europe may well, at one point in time, be stuck because the machine won't work anymore. This is a risk. It is a serious danger. I do not believe one bit, contrary to what I've heard occasionally, that the European adventure is an adventure that today is unable to stop or to move backward. I believe that Europe, which is an enterprise that goes basically against nature, it really goes against centuries and centuries of European history. This enterprise is not permanently part of our continent's map. And Europeans need to understand this, that Europe is not something that just kind of grew naturally out of our history. It didn't come naturally out of our culture. Europe is something that started one day because there were men who wanted it, and they wanted to stop the murders that we'd had in Europe for centuries, with all of these ongoing wars that ravaged the European continent, including 2 world wars. Europe is an enterprise of reason, of goodwill, of determination. And only the ability of Europeans to maintain this goodwill to have Europe progress will allow Europe to progress and not stagnate or move backward. Europe, one more time, is not an enterprise that is rooted into the map and the history of our continent. And Europeans need to be convinced of this. And I believe that this is the only way to ensure that European public opinion can be mobilized. We have to frighten the people of Europe. We have to convince them that Europe is not something that where they can consider that their future comfort is assured. Things could move backward, and we have to do something to make sure that public opinion continues to push their statesmen forward to work on the European construction ground. But does that mean that in this enlarged Europe to 25-30, that we will be able to keep moving with the integration process? The question has already been asked. I'm asking it because I am convinced that if in this long trail where we're going to have to integrate 20 new countries, which will really totally transform the landscape of Europe, I'm convinced that in this long path, if this integration process goes forward, and I believe that it's inevitable if the enlargement occurs quickly, I am convinced that Europe will be in a very difficult situation. What we know is that with 25 or 30, we will not be able to keep up with this integration process as we have pushed it forward for the last 40 years. Whatever the goodwill we might have to integrate the states of Eastern and Central Europe, because the history doesn't repeat itself. And Europe now has the opportunity to peacefully integrate all of these states together so that we can build a future of peace. This has never happened in Europe before. Do not forget, it's already been said this morning, and we have to say it again, in the introduction, the preamble to the first Treaty of Europe, the Treaty of Paris, the European Coal and Steel Community, peace was the most important word. And peace is a word that has been used in every preamble of our European treaties. And peace has been acquired, this time for the first time, at the same time that we agreed to move toward unity. And this is the first time that we will develop European unity through methods other than conquest, war, and things like that. If we want this unity to take place in an integration movement, well then, in this large number of European countries, we will have to have some sort of an engine that causes the integration process to move forward. And here I'm going to have to say a taboo word that we have been avoiding for some time now in the European debate, and the word is variable geometry Europe, not two-speed Europe, because that's a word that I don't like, but variable geometry Europe. In other words, a Europe where we will need a very strong engine that will continue to cause the European train to move forward. And even though we don't want all of the countries that comprise the European Union to have to integrate immediately all European powers. And in this train, in this engine, there will necessarily be the French-German core. I come back to this because it is of major importance, because it's symbolic of the new Europe. You should never forget that after the Second World War, France and Germany had no desire to reconcile. We always told the story of Europe, the golden legend, saying that it's because Germany and France instantly decided that they would reconcile that we were able to begin to build Europe. Not at all. France especially, that was still humiliated by the 1940 defeat, was not really ready to hold out an olive branch to its direct enemy. It was the English-speaking countries that were the first to put the issue on the table. Churchill first, who was the first to say, we won't be able to make a Europe without a French-German reconciliation. And obviously the United States played a role too. It took 3 to 4 years to convince the French to agree finally to start playing the reconciliation game. And never forget that the Schuman Declaration and what came out of it, in other words, the Treaty of Paris, that created the European Steel and Coal Community, is the first cornerstone of building Europe, but it's also the first stone of French-German reconciliation. And this is still of great importance because I believe that symbolically speaking it's very important, including in Europe of today. You have to realize that these two countries, these two peoples, that fought each other for centuries for supremacy on the European continent, not talking about Lille, which had other supremacy in mind. But in terms of the European continent, or the island, it was, on the continent it was between Germany and France, where we fought over control of the continent. These two people fought until the total devastation of World War II. And they actually came to the decision, starting in 1948-49, to do things differently. And this is a very strong message in the Europe of the post-Cold War, especially for the Balkans. It's important that you understand that nothing is impossible when you want peace to reign on a continent forever. And the French-German example is still very important today. And it's as strong today as it was in the past. It is important to know that inside this Europe that's moving toward unity, that the French-German engine is continuing to operate. And I know that it's not operating easily. Often we say that we're in a French-German crisis, but we've been living through this crisis for 50 years now. It's ongoing. We are still coming out of crises and going into new ones. This is of no importance as long as all of it can be resolved in the European context. France has invented Europe to better control the resurgence of Germany, but it got caught in its own game. And today, we realize that Europe is the only future that we have. But France and Germany alone can't cause Europe to move forward alone. It takes others, especially others that have been working with these two countries from the beginning of the adventure. They have to all be moving in the same direction. But it's this core that will help with the integration movement. It's true that there will be a core that will move along more slowly than others.
What is important is that Europe stay Europe, that this integrated Europe will welcome the others when they are ready for it. Enlargement will have occurred, but the enlargement will consist in transforming completely the Europe of 1959. It is at the core of this transformed Europe that we will see the central bloc progress, those who will maintain the movement of integration. And this movement of integration will only be able to progress if at the heart of this Europe, we also accept to permanently implement reforms, the necessary reforms for the common policies to evolve. There will be a reform of the common agricultural policy, I am convinced. One will not have to step back from the regional policies, but one will have to adapt this policy. These common policies will be adapted, they will be reformed. It is as important as a reform of the institutions, but these reforms will have to occur if one wishes to keep up the movement for integration. And it is at the end of this process that in a few decades that one can start talking about the identity of the European nation and not the constitution. I thank
you. Our next speaker is a familiar face at SAIS, Ulrike Guérot, who came to us who was educated in Germany, has worked for Jacques Delors as an aide for a number of years, taught here at SAIS, and is now in Berlin, where she is with the, how do they translate this into English? The Research Institute of the German Council on Foreign Relations, where she is the head of the EU unit. Ulrike, it's very nice to see you here.
I'm pleased to be back. Je voulais faire juste deux remarques. Une concernant ce que M. Lamassoure a dit, qui a dit que l'Europe sera fédérale,
who said that Europe will be federal or won't be at all. What I came to mind is that in 1971, Mr. Mitterrand said Europe will be socialist or Europe won't be. And today we can see that Europe isn't socialist, but Europe exists. So there are good news and bad news in what Mr. Lamassoure said. The bad news is that Europe might not be federal, and the good news is that Europe will always exist. There was not a socialist Europe for Mitterrand, and there might not be a federal Europe, but I'm convinced that Europe will exist. And I agree that Europe should be federal. The other comment I wanted to make is that I have that the Ambassador Scheer talked about Europe as being a dream, and I have a different approach. You will see that my topic is much more technical, but I think that one should Americanize this dream in the sense that I once heard the expression, a goal is a dream with a deadline.
We have a dream, or we had a dream, and that was the European dream, but now it's a goal, and it's a goal with a deadline, and the deadline is kind of 2010 and 2005, and now I'm switching on to English because I prepared to speak English, so even if my English is much not so good than my French, I go straight to sketch out a little bit what is the German opinion, or what is the German perspective on for the European Union, what is the agenda. I will be very technical in a very let's say, midterm perspective, and perhaps a little bit more positive than Ambassador Scheer has been, because I sense that there is a lot of dynamics in the European integration process after Nice. And what is this dynamic? Let me just sketch out in a few sentences. I think the European agenda is now very tough from today until 2004 because of three major reasons. That is because after the Treaty of Nice, we have three parallel developments, and that is first, we will have the euro in kind of 9 months now, and that will be a tremendous dynamic for the European integration. We will have the post-Nice process that is ongoing and that has started. The European Commission will give out a white book on European governance by July 2001, which is in kind of 4 months, and we will structure the post-Nice debate to come to an end with it around 2004 with another intergovernmental conference. And we will have the enlargement process, and what we have to do is to tie all these three processes together, because it's enlargement, it's post-Nice process, and it's the Euro. We will tie it together until 2004, and I think from now on until 2004 the Union will have changed in a very dramatic or tremendous way. So what is the post-Nice process? I think it's important in Washington area to sketch out this a little bit more in detail, because it might be a little bit flu seen from this capital. The post-Nice process is basically that at the end of the year in the European Council meeting in Laken under Belgian presidency, we will have an agenda to organize what we are calling now in Brussels a big civil society debate on post-Nice and what should be the European governance be about. So I think that's a tremendous dynamics in this process. I mean, just consider that the European Commission set up an internet webpage to sketch what is the European Constitution and to have public input from all the European trade union citizens and so on. And they have kind of 13,000 hints a day in their webpage of people writing to the European Commission. We would figure out Europe like this, like that. We would imagine that Europe is like this, like that. So I think there is a very intensive interest of the European population if you just consider this internet activity and the activity of the European civil society that is much engaged in what we call post-Nice process. So what will be done in Laken probably is that on the 4 items that are on the post-Nice agenda, and the items is that we have to work out what is the principle of subsidiarity. The second is the legal status of the Charter of Fundamental Rights. The third is the simplification of the EU treaties. And the fourth is the role of the national parliaments in the EU institutional architecture. That all these issues and items, I have to slow down, that all these issues, we will have national committees running working groups on the 4 issues, and then we will synthesize the debate. And this will be done, I think, in all the EU 15 countries. We will have a steering committee, hopefully that will be set up in the Laken summit also. And I think if you consider this process, the EU is at work, and the EU constitutional process is at work in this post-Nice process. And as I feel it as a convinced European, there's much dynamics in it, so that there's some hope that we will come to a process setting up a convent, not handling another intergovernmental conference. We surely will have a convent, involve civil society, make up synthesized papers of the EU national debates, putting them together via a steering committee and ending up in an intergovernmental conference around 2003, probably under the Italian presidency that is running the EU at the end of 2003, which means that then, basically, the European Union will be ready for enlargement. And as it has been said earlier this day, I believe that truly 10 out of the 12 candidate countries will be in the European Union before the European elections of the European Parliament in June 2004. That is the concrete perspective of the European Union. I think in June 2004 we will have a euro that is strong, that has the euro, that has 25 member states, not 27. Those who will not be in is Bulgaria and Romania. All the other probably will be in at that moment, and we will have IGC that has been run by a convent and that has been then underpinned by another IGC under Italian presidency. I see, if you look at the picture like this, there's lots of positive dynamics in it, and we shouldn't be ashamed or too hesitant about the European governance and European future. So, just a few remarks on what is the German opinion there, or what is the German position, because as it sends often and frequently, and also basically in Washington, in this country, is that Germany is now the biggest country, more important than ever. So it's perhaps important to say a few words about what's the German perspective and how do we feel, or how do I feel that Germany is developing in the European debate. I think that Germany sticks to a federal approach of European governance. And if you put together all the major speeches and all the major contributions we had in our country, which is from President Rau, from the famous Fischer speech, and Mr. Schäuble, I mean all the most important people sketching out European constitutional debate in Germany, you would say that the approach is that of course the Union has to be federal, of course we have to reinforce majority voting, of course we have to reinforce the role of the parliament, we cannot figure it out otherwise. It has been mentioned several times this day that if the Union is lacking something, then it is lacking a clear democratic system, because the European Parliament is not powerful enough, the European Council is opaque, the Council is opaque because it has on the one hand a legislative role, on the other hand an executive power. Nobody understands this. Brzezinski pointed it out. So we have to clarify the European system in a way that makes clear who is the executive, who is the legislative in our institutional system. And I think even that citizens are expecting this and not really opposing this. So once you get clear the horizontal power sharing in the European Union, we have to have a glance at what we call, or what we may call, a vertical power sharing, which is the question of subsidiarity. What does the Union do and what does the member state do? Who does what in the European Union? And I think that is a very, let's say, ambivalent debate. And I'm coming from Germany, where this debate is particularly ambivalent, like Mr. Scheer pointed out, because we have the Länder level that plays an important role in this debate. Why? Because the Länder level had the feeling over the past 20 years that we had something like creeping erosion of competences. The more we were giving from the national level to the EU level, in fact, basically the German Länder lost competences. So to avoid now what is called in the debate creeping erosion of competences, the splendid idea is we simply would have to work out a clear catalogue of competences, give this to the Union, give this to the national state, and then it's pretty clear and we could work like this. I'm, as a German, I would say that I don't believe any second in the workability of a clear catalogue of competences, simply because I know my country a little bit, and we have we tried to have clear competences for the nation state on the German national side and then for the Länder level, and basically we see in Germany that it didn't work for 40 years. I mean, basically, we had creeping erosion of the Länder level towards the German national level for 40 years. I don't know why a clear catalogue of competences should work for European Union. So it can't be the answer. And why can't it be the answer? The answer is it's not feasible. If you consider the duties that the EU has, I think what is we are speaking about what should be a global or European governance system for the Union. I think we cannot work with clear and enumerated competences for the EU level, because all the duties the EU will have to deal with, which is basically the euro, which is agriculture, it's all about duties that need multi-level governance. If you consider the euro and the management of the eurozone, you spill over from the euro, from the monetary side to the economic side to the social policy field, and so on and so forth. How will you work out a clear catalogue of competences telling that the ECB is responsible for the euro but not for the economic side, not for the social side? It all goes together, it has to go together, and if that is the case, we need a system of multi-level governance where we can assure that the national level and that the regional levels will participate in the management of European policy, but we cannot speak about clear division of powers in a vertical power sharing. I think that's not feasible. The problem will be, in my opinion, that we will have to trade off at some extent participation of regional and national levels against efficiency. The more you make actors in a policy process and the more you have actors in a governance process, the more opaque the system is and the less efficient it is. And that's basically a problem when we are speaking about European governance. And I think we have to have some thoughts about this. How do we trade off participation here against efficiency on the other side? But that's, I think, the true debate and not about a catalogue of competences. So the other thing is that I think if you consider not only German but European citizens, the problem is not about who does what I think it's not the important question whether it's the EU level that runs a policy or whether it's the national or regional level. I think what is really important is what's the result of the policy. If the EU does a good policy, I think it's accepted by population. So what matters is the result, it's the outcome, and it's the output. So I think that should be the question, how we should treat the governance problem of the European Union. I think that if we now consider a Franco-German dynamic on how we can work out a European governance in the future, I think we should not be too pessimistic. Because if I look on the German debate, of course I would say that the German debate is a constitutional debate, is a theoretic debate, and might be considered as being a top-down debate on how should it be done. Do we have two chambers, which would mean basically that the European Parliament is the first chamber and that the European Council will move the more and more to be a second chamber, which would mean that the European Parliament is the chamber, one person, one vote, and the European Council becomes the second chamber, like the US Senate, with one state, one vote, and then we would have a true federal regime for the European Union, and that would be nice, and that's the German vision. So this is the thing, and other speakers here from the French side were saying, okay, this is not like the French could imagine the system. I think basically we are coming to the same end if we consider that the French also have meanwhile the true feeling that we need some political governance for the euro. And I make this point again, I think the euro will dramatically change the landscape in European policy. It were the French who brought up the idea of economic government. We definitely need some political flanking of the euro, simply because I would like to quote Josef Schumpeter, who in the early 20s said once that all politics in the very end is monetary politics. If that is true, then we need a political system to deal with the euro and to deal with the eurozone. And what we need for this, basically we have it now. If you consider, let's say, the Treaty of Nice, some very tiny but very important developments can be said. For instance, some institutional things that has been dealt with in Nice is that the Euro group, which is the people or the states that are in the euro, they have now an upgrading of the Eurogroup. The Eurogroup was meant to be basically unofficial because we have the ECOFIN Council, and Great Britain, Sweden and other countries not being member of the Euro wanted that all the steering, flanking policy were done in the ECOFIN and not in the Eurogroup. Since Nice, we changed it. And we have now an institutional framework that that is in favor of the Eurogroup, and that makes an embryo of governance in this structure. So the point I'd like to make is that we will have this spillover effect, and this is last point perhaps, why the British feel so concerned about it. I'm frequently dealing with British journalists, and the only thing they ask is there a perspective for British-German partnership in the European Union? And my answer to the British people is as far as Britain is not in the euro, there's no British perception of Europe, and there's no British-German engine. So I think we come back to a Franco-German engine if we consider this effect of spillover that we will necessarily have for the political system that is based on the Eurozone. And what we need, and it might be the last point, what we truly need in Europe is a politicization of the EU institutional system that brings us back perhaps to a left-right-wing discussion in the European institution. What I mean by this is we should, instead of having European Parliament acting against the European Council and the Council acting against the Commission, we should have a left-wing, right-wing approach in the European Parliament, making an election in the European Parliament that elects a European President of the Commission, and then the European parties would run with a right-wing or left-wing concept of European economics, and the people would then be able to sanction via the parliamentarian elections, or the elections of the European Parliament would be able to sanction whether they like to have a left-wing commission or right-wing commission. And this is in fact the political dynamics we definitely will need when we have to manage the Eurozone and everything that it applies. So Last sentence, if that is the picture for the European Union, I think we shouldn't feel that much hesitating. If the perspective is that in 2004 we are 25 countries, then we will have 500 million consumers, which is twice more consumers than the United States, which is a bigger GDP, which is a very integrated single market and a very strong economy with one liquid financial market, with a political governance that we will have worked out through this post-Nice process. So I'm not basically afraid, neither by enlargement, neither losing identity, neither by diluting the union. I think around 2004 we will have a strong union, we will have a pretty good political governance, we will have a strong currency, and I think that it will be the moment where the European Union will come as a big civilian power that ought to be taken very seriously by the US. Thank you.
Bravo, Ulrike. We, of course, have saved the best to the last, and if there's any speaker who can conclude all of these issues in some wonderfully logical fashion, it will be our final speaker. She has been a long-time member of CERI, more formally a senior research fellow at the Fondation Nationale des Sciences Politiques, and she has been, for many years, a leading French student of European affairs. Francoise De La Serre.
Alors c'est évidemment une tâche très difficile que d'être le dernier orateur de ce débat qui a été très riche.
Debate that was very rich. Many things were said and many things were contradicted. And I don't want to add to what has already been said. What I wish to do is to make a few comments on a topic that seems important to me, especially considering the program that you prepared for us. And this concerns governance in an enlarged Europe, given the important debates that stem from the introduction of a minimum of flexibility in the European Union. One should wonder on the need of strengthened cooperation and of their raison d'être. At the request of the organizers, I have prepared my speech in English, so you will suffer, but I will continue in English.
I think it's important to recall that the idea of differentiation flexibility is not new in the European community. It has always been a feature of the community process right from the beginning. And an inventory of the community practices reveals a wide range of differentiation, be it transitional arrangements for successive enlargements, or the opting out allowed for in the Maastricht Treaty to accommodate the exceptionalism of the most reluctant member state vis-à-vis integration. The debate on flexibility resurfaced in the mid-90s, meaning different things to different people. The most reluctant member states, and notably Britain, advocated flexibility to have a kind of Europe à la carte and less integration. On the opposite, two German Christian Democrats member of parliament, Mr. Schäuble and Lammers, in 1994, sought to build on the membership of EMU a hard core of countries determined to push integration forward. And more generally, for a lot of people, flexibility appeared at the time, after the green light given to enlargement by the Copenhagen European Council, as the miracle solution that would allow the Union to have the best of both worlds, enlargement and deepening. France and Germany became much in favor of what became known as coopération renforcée, enhanced cooperation, and sought to introduce in the Treaty of Amsterdam some clauses permitting a limited number of member states to proceed with integration further and more quickly. Finally, the 1997 Amsterdam Treaty introduced provisions on closer cooperation, but the mechanism created suffered from certain limitations, There was a very cumbersome and complicated triggering procedure. There was also the possibility for one member state to veto a coopération renforcée if he disagreed. And equally, there was an exclusion of the common foreign and security policy from enhanced cooperation. Those shortcomings of the Amsterdam Treaty concerning closer cooperation led the member states to put it again on the agenda of the IGC. And the Nice Treaty has brought some improvements facilitating the launching of an enhanced cooperation. The triggering procedure is less cumbersome. The right of a country to veto enhanced cooperation is removed, and the safeguards for the community system decided at Amsterdam are maintained and reinforced. Any coopération renforcée will have to take place in the institutional system. It will have to be open to all member states who will be able and willing to join in. And finally, those enhanced cooperation cannot concern the acquis communautaire or the area of exclusive community competences. But what has been presented, in my opinion, as one of the most positive results of Nice needs, however, to be qualified, and I would like to stress 2 points. First, enhanced cooperation will not apply to the second pillar, CFSP and defense. Of course, given the unpredictability of crises that arise in the field of foreign policy, it was extremely difficult to imagine some kind of predetermined cooperation, like, for instance, EMU. But one could have wished to have some kind of enabling clauses allowing some member states to undertake action in the name of the EU. Besides, flexibility in the second pillar could have been useful to avoid the multiplication of contact groups and ad hoc cooperation outside the treaties, and also it could have provided the legal basis for the development of cooperation in the field of arms procurement. The second point I would like to make is that the improvement of the enhanced cooperation mechanism appears also to have been detrimental to a comprehensive institutional reform, in particular because it has undermined the case for the extension of qualified majority voting. But the main question, I think, about enhanced cooperation concerns its raison d'être and its finality. And here again, I would like to make 2 remarks. First, enhanced cooperation will not affect decisively the process of enlargement, contrary to what had been imagined some time. A strategy of enlargement based upon a differentiated acceptance of the acquis and leading to a kind of to a formula of partial or affiliate membership has been rolled out. Enlargement will take place according to principles and methods adopted in the past and based upon the reprise of the acquis communautaire. Thus, enhanced cooperation will not affect enlargement for 2 reasons. Because the acquis, which lies at the heart of the accession negotiations, is excluded of coopération renforcée, and also because this coopération renforcée aims at developing new steps in integration rather than at excluding newcomers from existing policies. The second remark I would like to make concerns the genuine impact enhanced cooperation will have on the future shape of the European Union. In theory, 2 options are open. According to the first one, the existing mechanism will lead to the creation of different circles of enhanced cooperation with a variable composition according to the domain concerned. Given the restrictions imposed by the treaty, the area of predilection of enhanced cooperation could probably be the policies linked to EMU and still submitted to unanimous decision-making, and equally also probably some areas of internal security. But it remains to be seen whether such a juxtaposition of enhanced cooperation will constitute a lever for more integration or not. If we take the example of the attractiveness exerted by EMU on those who didn't take part from the beginning, it is not impossible, but it is not guaranteed, because there is also a risk of drifting towards a Europe à la carte. The second option is the option evocated by Joschka Fischer. According to him, enhanced cooperation could produce a core group associating the same member states in the same important domains. Such a core group would be the motor of integration, would form a center of gravity and develop its own institution, and be ultimately the nucleus of an eventual federation. President Chirac, in the speech he made last year before the Bundestag, last June, also mentioned the possibility for some member states engaged in closer cooperation to form a pioneer group working inside or outside the treaties, but he added that this pioneer group should be supported by some sort of secretariat, which reminds us a little bit of the Plan Fouché. The main problem raised by this approach is that in the current context, such a grouping of the same countries participating in the same cooperation seems elusive, because the group of states taking part in EMU is not the same as the group which might be willing to cooperate in the fields of internal security or in the field of defense, all the more so since defense is excluded from enhanced cooperation. This is probably why Jacques Delors has some reservations about the role of enhanced cooperation in the building of an avant-garde. To create this avant-garde, as he said this morning, he favors a deliberate political act of refoundation, although he admits that it might be worth trying the experience of enhanced cooperation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. What I would propose to do now is to ask the audience to take 5 or 6 questions, which we will group, and then to give our speakers a chance for a final word. These may be questions or challenges, if you like. Is there anyone who would care? I don't know whether we have microphones around. We do. All we need now are questions. The woman is crazy. No, God, what is that?
And I work with the Bosnia Support Committee. I wanted to ask a question about, I know this isn't for this panel, but I didn't get a chance to ask it for the other one, about the development or the change in Russia. It was one of the speakers this morning that said that as the Europe develops and changes and establishes a new identity, then Russia will develop and change and establish a new identity. And I was wondering if anyone on the panel would like to sort of suggest what that identity might be.
Thank you very much. Yes, please. That's a good question.
Hi, my name is Chris Exarlis. I'm a student at SAIS. A couple of the panelists mentioned something about the issues of democratic legitimacy of the institutional structure and this whole issue of the democratic deficit. I wondered if you could address that a little more specifically with the institutional reform ideas, if there's an idea to how things have improved with Nice, but also beyond that for the role for the Parliament, and I guess Ms. Guérot also mentioned the idea of involving national parliaments some more. If you could address those, I appreciate it. Thanks.
It's tomorrow's topic.
Yes, I think those issues are going to come up tomorrow, so that...
Are you here?
Yes. Any more questions? Observations? Yes, in the back.
Hi, my name's Alan Ingram, Department of Geography from Cambridge University. And my question is about obligations and identity. Much has been said about the need or the difficulties in creating a European identity. And I think one of the things which would make a great contribution to that is a sense of mutual obligation. And particularly with the issue of enlargement, this is going to involve bringing in general, poorer countries that are going to be on the economic periphery. And this is going to raise profound questions about redistribution. So I just wonder if the panelists could offer some comments about the meaning of that for European identity.
Well, if there are no further questions, perhaps are there? There are.
My name is Pierre Gojat, French-American Chamber of Commerce, and this is maybe a question more to Justice Breyer, if I may. With your experience, of course, in this great country, seeing what you have heard, hearing what you have heard, and to diminish the cultural gap, what would be your recommendations in order to make people understand better, whether it's from a legal point of view or otherwise?
Maybe we should start with Justice Breyer and move this way for final comments.
Un mot pour se faire s'entendre mieux, avoir
to agree better, to have conferences like this one. That's all we need.
Let's see. Next turn.
I'd like to touch upon two questions that raises the question of democracy. I think democracy basically has something or a lot to do with legitimacy, and that is the question of identity, to which democracy we do have an emotional commitment, like Brzezinski would put it. And I think that is what I try to point out. Everybody feels lost in the European system because it's much too complicated, it's not pretty clear, it's not efficient, so we have to clarify it. If we are going to clarify it, it can't be others, then, I would really stick to what Mr. Lamassoure, Mr. Scheer also believe. It can only be federal. If it is federal, it has to be political. If it has to be political, we have to design it in a classical right-left-wing scheme where groups can express which policy they want to run. It will not be up to the ECB to decide whether we do this or that monetary policy in the very end. We will have to have a forum that allows people to do a right stance or a left-wing stance in politics, and that has to be decided in a European Parliament, and the institutional system has to be shaped to allow this. I think that's my true conviction. That will be one of the institutional process to make democracy work in Europe in the next 3, 4 or 5 years. And the question on economic redistribution, yes, I think Mr. Scheer touched upon it. We will have another structure of European agricultural policy, for sure. We will have the midterm negotiation of Agenda 2000 next year. We will have, by the way, hard struggle with France on the idea of co-financing or not, of renationalization of the agricultural policy. Whether we can spend more money to the eastern countries and the candidate countries will basically depend on the fact that we reduce the share of the agricultural budget to the whole EU budget. It's roughly 50% now. We have to reduce it to 30% or something even less, and just tell that if the Union is going to be a state or a power without without state or a state without power, but an entity that acts and that is powerful, then it has to take into account into the budget also the duties that a power or a state should have, and that is how to assure the borders, and how do we do social redistribution, and how do we maintain our social economic model. And I think, of course, I would go with you saying that for the moment the EU is not yet a solidarity community, and we have the whole debate of that nobody wants to finance the southern part of Italy and nobody wants to spend too much money in Romania, and of course we have these debates. On the other hand, I think we have quite creative debates in Europe. In Germany, I just want to give one example very precisely, that Mr. Schäuble, who's kind of important in Germany, he spoke openly out the word of Länderfinanzausgleich, which is a kind of federal fiscal system for the European Union, which is another taboo. If one taboo is the word federal in the political debate, the other word is the federal fiscalism in the economic side. I think we have to speak it out. Anyway, we are spending money for other poorer zones via cohesion funds and via regional funds and via structural funds. We don't call it federal fiscalism for the moment. If we restructure the whole system without spending more money, we could go to some system of federal fiscalism, which means basically if we do have asymmetric shocks in the Euroland zone and one country is more affected than another country, then of course the Union will give some money for a decent time that this country can recover. Anyway, we are in the same boat in Europe, and if one country is going to be bankrupt, either we have fiscal federalism or not, the whole union will be affected. So I don't know what is worth talking about. We will go to some system like this. It's a taboo for the moment, but I think we will have to clarify quickly this debate also.
I have two comments, one on the democratic deficit and one on Russia. The question of democratic deficit relates to the same basic problem that Francois Scheer mentioned when he talked about the absence of dream, and that is we have to recognize that unfortunately the European Union project doesn't have the full support that we would like to have. In my own country, that is certainly a problem, but also in many other European countries. So what is needed, in my view, is both to deal with these issues institutionally about the democratic deficit, but also to deal with two basic issues. One is to formulate this vision that I try to describe in the form of the strength defined in the manner that I try to, and also the enlargement as the project to safeguard peace in Europe. But that is too lofty to really be alive to make the European Union project alive to people on the street, the man or the woman in the street. There has to be, I would like to phrase it, a day-to-day relevance, a situation. The European Union has to be seen as meaningful and positive and valuable to people in their daily life. So you need both the vision and the attachment to the realities of daily life. And that means that the European Union must be meaningful on issues that relate to environment, jobs, consumers, and so forth. The Swedish priorities for the European Union, by the way, were enlargement first, and then employment, and then environment. My wife suggested that we should add another two E's, education and equality. Half of the members of the Swedish government are women. But I said we men can only remember three things at a time. So the Prime Minister decided that we go for three. But anyway, so I think you have to have both the vision and the attachment to the day-to-day relevance, apart from the dealing with the democratic deficit. On Russia, we had President Putin in Stockholm at the summit meeting last week. That discussion dealt mainly with the economic and social development in Russia, which is, of course, crucial. And I think in today's world, the economic and social development of Russia will also be determining the security issues and the direction Russia goes, which shows, again, makes the point of how domestic and foreign policies are intertwined. Europe is pursuing a two-track policy vis-à-vis Russia. One is to integrate Russia as much as possible in Western economic and political structures. and to try to see Russia as much as possible as a partner. On the other hand, there are very strong reactions, which are based on our attachment to values when it comes to the war in Chechnya, when it comes to press freedom, the extent of certain phenomena like corruption in certain parts of that society. Then we speak out too. So a mature relationship, a relationship based on both integrating Russia as much as possible. It's an historic chance when they are now on their road to market economy and democracy, and are well underway, we hope, but at the same time stand firm on principles. So those were the two comments that I was inspired to make. Thank you.
Thank you. Madame Veil.
Yes, I had one thing to say about the question that was raised when the man asked to strengthen the European identity, shouldn't we create the obligation of taking in poorer countries? I think it's a very interesting question, but I don't think that we're moving forward when we ask it in this manner. I think if we want to strengthen European identity, that we need to talk more about solidarity as opposed to obligation. Actually, it comes back to being the same thing, ultimately. Solidarity toward poorer countries, but for people, you can't talk about aversion, about repentance, obligations, moral obligations. I don't think that that's very frequent. People don't like that. They don't like all of these negative things that they feel are gratuitous unless you have a certain meaning. So I think it's the meaning that you need to look for. And if you're talking about enlargement, then I believe that enlargement has a very great meaning. And the morals and the ethics of solidarity, and those are the values that we have to discuss. And we shouldn't be talking about obligations. I like to do things because I feel that they're useful, not because I feel that it's a duty. So to get to the same result, I think we need to present things more positively, not as an obligation, but as the opportunity to give meaning to Europe by doing something that is important for the people and that's moral for us. Personally, I believe that today what you've selected as an obligation, in my opinion, this is the only important thing that we can find and that can substitute for the initial designs, with this dream, something that's important. I think enlargement is important, and that's why I'm in favor of it. I know all the problems, but if we don't enlarge, we will feel guilty, and it will be a handicap, a great handicap for the coming years for Europe, because first of all, there are countries in which we feel that they need to come in, and also because it gives a new breath of life. That's all part of the adventure. Maybe we might have thought that the adventure could have been technology-based, medicine-based, or who knows, some sort of a new conquest. I don't think that that's what it's about now. I think enlargement is important, and I think that it should rally a lot of people together, even if it doesn't rally all governments together. I think it rallies a lot of Europeans together, because since 1989, they would finally say, okay, now we're moving in the right direction. And it's so important for my generation and for generations behind me and in front of me, so that they thought that Europe was a dream, that we were part of this major adventure, and that it was a turning point in history that we were living through when we were promoting peace. It was very difficult. I know that there were emotional problems and moral problems too. And maybe they were just symptomatic of other problems that we find in enlargement. But we managed to survive because we realized that for the younger generations, it was the only way to get the feeling that we were changing, that we could change history, that peoples could really improve their fate.
Mr.
Lamassoure, we have to talk about Yeah. In terms of identity, I'd like to tell a story. I was in a symposium like this a while ago in Europe, and the theme was, what has Europe given to your country? There was a representative from each European country, and what it did is it helped me realize that one of the reasons why Europe has succeeded is that each nation that composes it, in the European community, each nation found an answer to one of its historical ambitions, or a way to overcome a historical failure. So for the Germans, it's after everything that happened, as we know, Germany needed to prove to itself and to prove to others that it was capable of building a true democracy in peace with its neighbors. For France, it was also obvious. France was unhappy for a long time about no longer being a major world power. For France, for a long time, the European community was an opportunity to get back this illusion of weighing heavily on the world scale, and that France could become powerful vis-à-vis Germany once again. And there could be French foreign policy because Germany's situation wasn't totally settled yet. Germany wasn't totally reunified. Spain found an opportunity revenge after historic decline, after the tragedy that it experienced in the 20th century with Civil War, Franco, and it was an opportunity for Spain to come back to the first division, among the major countries that count. And when it decided to join the euro, then that was really something. For Ireland and Portugal, these are countries that have suffered historically because they had a big neighbor right next to them, and often they were persecuted by that big neighbor. And this time, they really saw that they could have more neighbors. Ireland used to have one neighbor, now they've got 14. Portugal used to have one big neighbor, now they've got 14 neighbors. And Greece found money. And England didn't really get anything out of it at all, because our British friends, who are like the French, they regret the lack of the loss of their empire. So then there's this new president of the United States, and the next day the British Prime Minister in his office. And Great Britain feels that it's one of the closest allies of the U.S., and it inspires the U.S., and since the U.S. is the world's biggest power, Great Britain inspires the world's biggest power. And it likes to be close to such a dominant country in the world. Along with that, what the European community can bring is prosaic. So we see that in the Union, there are countries that found sublimation of their ambitions, their rewards, historical rewards. And there are other countries that reason more or less as what am I gaining and what am I losing. And then you find the countries that are most committed, and those are different ones. Once we've realized this, that explains the past. The problem that we're finding today, that we're realizing today, is what is the common goal that we'll be able to have together as one. Because our national frustrations, that's fine, that's one thing. It explains the past and it helps with the present. But now, if we really want to build Europe a political federation, we need to have a common goal, perhaps a dream, but at least a common goal.
Justice Breyer, a final word.
Because I didn't know if that was our final word before or not. So I actually, je voulais dire quatre choses. Première remarque, une anecdote.
I have to say first a story. That's good, Mr. Lamassoure, Mr. Minister. In the U.S. we have a constitution, you know. I think we do.
Nous n'avons pas un traité.
We don't have a treaty.
Nous avons un gouvernement.
We have a government.
Mais avec tout cela,
but with all of that, what we needed, it took 30 years, not 15, to come up with the peanut butter label on our, like your jelly, like your jam. Second remark, and this is somewhat pessimistic. Madison said, one of the things that was most important to make our Constitution was that the deliberations were secret, and that was the case for 30, 40, 50 years. And I believe that this would be impossible today. Third remark, somewhat optimistic. That same James Madison and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and Hamilton and even Aaron Burr all had different ideas. Even after the Constitution was written, different ideas of what the U.S. would become. There was not one single vision. That came afterwards. So, if all of you have different ideas, there's not a major difference between this point in time and the foundation of the U.S. Fourth and final remark, and I hope that this is somewhat constructive. As I said before, I said we need more meetings, more conferences like this one. But I want to say in English
that I'm here, I think not just because it's of great interest, though it is, but it is also of great importance, I think, to people in the United States. And not simply because of the power and the importance of Europe, but in part because we in the United States do not have a definitive and final solution to the problems of the economy, nor do we have a definitive and final solution to the problem that, just like the woman in Naples who fears the power of Brussels, a woman in Des Moines fears the power of Washington. Those problems have not been definitively resolved, nor, despite our Constitution of 200 years, have we definitively resolved the problems of human liberty. So I think this is important because we are struggling with the same problems, and that people in all these nations have the same problems, and how you work them out will have a direct effect upon us, not just because of the power, but because we can learn from you. And I think that this has been a learning experience for me, and that's another reason why I'm very glad that you had this meeting.
Hear, hear. Madame De La Serre.
Deux réactions à des propos qui viennent d'être tenus et
two reactions to what has just been said, and also to what Lamassoure said, to the fact that the UK didn't get anything out of the European Union. I disagree with this, and I think that the UK, through the single market, has implemented some of its ambitions in Europe. Mrs. Thatcher said that she has contaminated the rest of Europe with her excellent liberalization recipes, and I think that the British, even if they keep up contacts with Washington, and these are but these are still ritual. They no longer consider that they really are the power behind the scenes. They might feel that the UK is more important in Europe and that they are interesting partners. All the efforts that Tony Blair did to enter into Europe, since the UK was not a member of the Economic and Monetary Union, through the common French-British defense initiatives, this shows that there is, from the UK, a research of something, and that something is to have a stronger and stronger influence on the integration process. The second reaction that I have to the comments that have been the comments that were made by Ulrike and Mr. Scheer, these concern the relationship between France and Germany. And from my point of view, this is really an example of enhanced cooperation. It is the condition of the development of all the other issues. And some efforts of mutual understanding have been carried out recently, but I think nonetheless that even though the Germans seem to be more enthusiastic in the debate after Nice in their opening towards a more federal Europe, there are still misunderstandings, there are still things that are left unsaid, and specifically the way in which they negotiated successfully in Nice, since they got what they wanted, the way in which they negotiated thus is not exactly consistent with the positions that they have stated they had as regards European federalism. Yes, a word on the issue of frustrations that were mentioned by Alain Lamassoure, frustrations which were the underpinning of many member states when they embarked on their European adventure. I think that these frustrations still play a role in the current movement, even if in most of our cases we have overcome them, and I'm not even sure that that is entirely true, but nonetheless, they remain very present in the way that we perceive the other countries. When France today talk about the power of Europe, I am not sure that France does not have somewhere in mind the fact that if Europe becomes a power, a real power, this enables France to imagine that France is still a power. But what is obvious is that this is how others perceive France. When we talk about the need for Europe to affirm itself as a power, the interpretation that most partners have, beginning with Germany, is that France still lives a dream of national power. And this, of course, makes things more complicated, especially when our partners, with some relish, underscore the fact that if France wants Europe to become a power, it is to resist the United States, because our partners are convinced that everything that we do is based on our anti-American position, and this makes things complicated within the European Union. But we are responsible to some extent of this vision, even though it's not really based on facts, because there have been, at some time in the past, even during the building of Europe, there have been French attitudes that could be interpreted as being unfriendly towards our hereditary friend. It's much harder to speak with a hereditary friend than with a hereditary enemy. As regards the British issue, well, I think indeed that, as Francoise De La Serre has said, that the UK is today convinced that they belong to Europe. It is not easy for the British to really wrap their minds around this certainty, but I think that they know that today their destiny is linked much closely to the European unity, and much more so than to the special relationship that they have with the United States. Especially since the European Union, one of the goals of the European Union is to develop a privileged relationship with the United States. And it is thus that the European Union can convince the United Kingdom that this relationship is a priority for Europe, and therefore the United Kingdom is coming closer and closer to Europe. And I am convinced, and I say this emphatically because I have for a long time been convinced that we were wrong when we opened the doors of the European community to the United Kingdom, or I thought that the doors had been thrown open too soon. But I am convinced that if the United Kingdom should distance itself towards the construction of Europe, this would be a loss for Europe today. And therefore, it is crucial that we be able to convince the United Kingdom that its place is within this future Europe. And the movement that the British developed in matters pertaining to defense, because they were at the root of the initiative that is underway right now for the defense of Europe, shows that they are going along those lines, even though one can still wonder if this is the case or not. And the idea that one has of the frustrations of the other countries often taints our own perceptions, even if we can wonder if this is not one more British maneuver to break Europe. But I don't think that is the case. What I wanted to say, quite simply, and this will be my concluding comment, is that what we need to be aware of when we build the enhanced cooperation that were mentioned by Francoise De La Serre is that this enhanced cooperation, which will help the European integration to progress, this enhanced cooperation should not be a factor that leads to the dismantling of the European Union. Because if everybody builds their own enhanced cooperation on the topics that they are interested in, well then tomorrow we will have a totally disfigured Europe that will appear. There can be enhanced cooperation which takes into account certain countries which are not part of other enhanced cooperations. Today, the United Kingdom could participate in the defense Europe, and but they are not yet in the monetary Europe. But what is obvious is that at the heart of all of these enhanced cooperations, they should always have, we always need the same core. This is a necessity, because otherwise I'm convinced that the enhanced cooperations will be a factor that goes against the European construct and not in favor of this construct.
Thank you. Well, I guess we are at the end, at least for today. Let me say how pleasing it is to see so many people from outside of SAIS, and particularly from other universities. I hope you will have enjoyed this as much as we have, and I hope you will come back tomorrow. I also like to thank our speakers, Madame Veil and the panel. This has been a wonderful exercise in professionalism. People have said a great deal, and they've said it very concisely. It's a sort of miraculous performance, it seems to me, this afternoon. Obviously, no one can summarize the enormous number of things that have been said and the richness of them. I can only say again, I suppose, what Stephen Breyer has just said. As an American, one senses the enormous importance of all of this for the United States, not only because it's very difficult to imagine a very good world in the future if Europe fails in this great endeavor, but also because we ourselves have a great deal to learn from what is being attempted in Europe now. I suppose it's easy enough to get discouraged about all these things. It is immensely complicated, as no one needs to be reminded after this afternoon. But I suppose the difficulties have to be compared with the grandeur of what is being attempted in Europe, which is something quite remarkable in human history, and certainly very important for the future. Thank you. See you all tomorrow.